All right, if you missed class today, I'm going to go through the things that you need. There's a link on this page that you can click on from your Module 9 file because it is a hyperlink, or you can click on the link that's on today's Schoology page. It'll take you to a short video made by Disney about James Monroe while he was president. Disney has a series of videos about all of the presidents, which are very informative, and they're nice and short too. So you need to watch that video. After you watch the video, you can come back to this video to get the answers to the questions. So press pause now and go watch that video if you have not done that yet, okay? But here we go. If you're ready for the answers, I'm going to give them to you now. So the nickname of James Monroe's presidency was the era of good feelings. It was really a good time in America. There were a lot of cool things going on. As you know, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The War of 1812 was over, and America was starting to invest in great building projects and infrastructure in America to make everything better. Massive building projects like the Erie Canal and roads, all kinds of ways to connect us because of the transportation revolution and the industrial revolution and the revolution in communication. This is all really taking flight during James Monroe's presidency. So he really enjoyed a great deal of domestic bliss, let's just say, until a certain territory decides that they want to enter the Union. So as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, we have a lot of different territories that are added to the United States. But when you add land to the United States, that land does not automatically become a state. It's a territory. And then if that territory wants to become a state, they apply for statehood. That's what it's called. And Congress ultimately is going to decide if they're going to entertain this idea or not. And then it goes to the state legislatures to decide as well. So there are a lot of people involved in the decision, but the decision begins with Congress. And so the territory of Missouri enters an application for statehood. And that is actually a problem. You would think that everybody would be excited about the growth of America, but actually there are some reservations. And the reason is because it would upset the balance between free and slave states. If you think about it, I know we've mentioned slavery. We haven't talked a lot about slavery yet. We're saving that for later. But slavery is going on in America, and it is mostly in the South. So if you picture the map, and I'm going to show you a map in a few minutes so that you actually have an illustration of this. If you picture the map in your head, most of the northern states did not have slavery anymore or only had a few slaves. It really was not a major part of their lives or their economy. But in the South, there are a lot of slave states. Most of the states in the South, actually all of them, had slaves. So at the time that Missouri is applying for statehood, whatever they become, whether they become a free state or a slave state, it's going to upset the balance. In Congress, there was an equal number of representation from free states and slave states. It's kind of like how the Senate is going to be from now on because it's half Republican, half Democrat. It's balanced. But if Missouri comes in, whatever they choose to be, it's going to upset that balance, and neither side wants to see that happen. So they end up coming to an agreement, and it becomes known as the Missouri Compromise. It was actually promoted by a man named Henry Clay. This is somebody that we are going to be hearing a lot about. This is just the beginning. He was mentioned in the article about how we got Florida. He was the one that was criticizing Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson came to hate him because of it. But that was just the beginning, trust me. And now Henry Clay is in Congress, and he's going to be the one that comes up with the idea of the Missouri Compromise. He's the one that's going to promote it. That actually was not in the video. They did not mention his name in the video. I wanted to give you that answer because I want that name to become very familiar to you as we move forward. So what are the conditions of the Missouri Compromise? There are 3 conditions. First of all, Missouri is going to enter the Union as a slave state. Secondly, Maine is going to enter as a free state. This is what will keep the balance. So that makes everybody happy. Maine was a territory that we have had really since the beginning of being colonies and then being the United States, but it's always been a territory, and it was originally part of the original colony of Massachusetts, but then it became a territory because it did not become a part of the state of Massachusetts. So it's just kind of been floating up there and didn't really have much of an identity. So they figured now's the time. Let's bring Maine in as a state as well, and that will keep the balance. So there will be slaves in Missouri, but there will not be slaves in Maine. That's fine, but they also recognized at the time that this is a problem that's probably going to keep coming up, because as we move further and further west, we're going to keep adding new territories. And every time we add a territory, this question is going to come up and we're going to have a problem. So they decided to solve the problem for the future. They said, in the future, from now on, there's going to be no slavery above the 3630 line. So that's 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude. You guys learned about longitude and latitude, I think, in 6th grade. So hopefully you remember what that means. Those are the lines on the map. And if you look at a map at where the 3630 line is, they're saying from now on, if we add any more territories, if it's above that line, they're not going to be allowed to have slaves. And that will kind of keep it even in the future as well. And we won't have to keep coming back to this problem. So it seems like a good solution, except for people who want to get rid of slavery altogether. They, of course, don't like this idea. But it calms everybody down for the time being. But believe me, this issue is not going away. And it's going to come back again and again and again. Another issue that's going on during Monroe's presidency, in his State of the Union speech that he gives during his presidency, he declares that Europe needed to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. He basically just makes this grand announcement like, listen, this is our turf and you need to stay out. Whatever colonies you have over here is enough. You don't need to be adding any more to your empires. And that was a really bold move because we were a relatively new country. It hadn't been very long since the War of 1812. And here we are puffing out our chests and saying, look, you need to stay out of our backyard. So it was basically a matter of self-preservation. And this becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, which goes down in history as a very famous philosophy. And we're going to build on that philosophy as America grows and as America becomes more and more powerful on the world stage, eventually backing it up with military. So that's what's going on during his presidency. It's relatively peaceful, but he does have to deal with a couple issues here. The Missouri Compromise, and then, of course, kind of announcing to the world that we are to be taken seriously and y'all need to stay out of our backyard. I want to show you a map of the Missouri Compromise. This is in your file. This is just a picture of a paper map that I have. That was the best way for me to show you what everything looks like. The orange states and territories are free states and territories. So that's where slavery is not going to be happening. Okay, it's not going to be allowed in those orange territories. As you can see, Pennsylvania is one of them. So we were one of the free states. And basically everything south of us is a slave state or slave territory. As a result of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri is going to be a slave state. So notice it is blue. That's Missouri. Even though it is a little further north than the others for the most part, it is going to be a slave state. It's kind of an anomaly. But because of that, they make Maine a free state. So that's what keeps the balance and everybody's happy. But to solve the problem for the future, like I said earlier, they do establish this 3630 line. You see that? That's pretty much, I mean, not exactly, but I hand drew this, so cut me some slack. But that's pretty much where the 3630 line falls on the map. So they're saying from now on, if we add any more states and they are north of that line, they're not going to be allowed to have slavery. So in other words, if we develop any more states in this territory or this territory, since they're above that line, they're going to be free states. And if Arkansas becomes a state, that's going to be possibly a slave state if they want to have slaves. And if we would ever possibly take over the territory that is Spanish, out here, I'll circle it with blue so it's a different color. This is all Spanish territory. If we would ever happen to take over that territory, if it's above the line here, they would not be allowed to have slaves. But if it's below the line, they could. So that's basically how they think they're going to solve the problem for the future. I hope that illustration helps you understand what's going on there. This issue is going to keep coming back to haunt us, as you know, and I keep foreshadowing for you, ultimately leading to the Civil War. But for the time being, it remains peaceful because of this compromise. There's one more thing that we did in class today. We learned about the court case called McCulloch versus Maryland. So on the next page of your file, there are actually some notes there. They're already typed out for you, but I wanted to read through the paragraph from your book that we read today in class. So I'm just going to read through this with you now, and then I'll go through the notes with you so you understand what's going on there and why it was important. I want you to remember back when Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, he created the U.S. Bank, which was very controversial at the time because the Democratic Republicans said he didn't have the constitutional power to do so, but it ended up passing anyway. And he gave it an expiration date. He said, okay, well, when it's up for renewal, you guys can decide if it was a good idea or not. Something else that he did to make them happy was he kind of distributed the power of this because they were afraid it would be a monopoly. So he said, all right, well, let's put branches in all of the states. So it's not a monopoly. It spreads out the wealth and the power. So every state has a branch of the U.S. Bank, and that's where we start our story here. Maryland tried to pass a tax that would limit the bank's operations. James McCulloch, cashier of the bank's branch in Maryland, refused to pay the tax. So in other words, the state of Maryland is trying to tax the U.S. Bank in Maryland. The state took him to court because he wouldn't pay the tax. And the resulting case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the landmark case McCulloch versus Maryland, the court decision was that the national bank was constitutional. During the early 1800s, the Supreme Court made several rulings, including McCulloch versus Maryland, that helped define federal power over contracts and commerce. These rulings reinforced capitalism as the ruling economic system in the United States. So when the state government, the state of Maryland, says to the U.S. Bank in Maryland, you have to pay us a tax, this guy, that's John Marshall. James McCulloch, the head cashier of that branch, says, well, you can't tax my entity. We are a federal bank, and a state government cannot tax a federal bank. So that's how it ends up going to the Supreme Court. And the question arises, is the U.S. Bank even constitutional? Which was always the argument that Thomas Jefferson was trying to say. He tried to argue for years that it was unconstitutional. So now it's finally come before the Supreme Court for them to decide. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Bank of the United States is constitutional. I have that highlighted because that's going to be a test item. So you might want to highlight that on yours as well. So he decides that it is constitutional. Thomas Jefferson would have disagreed, I'm sure. But what is so important about this? Like, who cares, right? Well, this is the reason it's important. It sets two precedents for the future, which is what Supreme Court cases usually do. One of them is the elastic clause. He cites in the Constitution the section and line in the Constitution that he claims allows for loose interpretation of the Constitution. So that we call that the elastic clause because elastic stretches, and this is like you're stretching the meaning of the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton would have loved this ruling. Not only was his bank declared constitutional, but he was always a loose interpreter of the Constitution, saying that we should just be able to do whatever makes sense, and now the Supreme Court is agreeing with him. The Supreme Court also cites a clause in the Constitution that we call the Supremacy Clause that says federal law is superior to state law. So that was another argument they made. The state cannot tax a federal entity because the federal government is actually supposed to be superior to state government. So those two things are important to understand. Just being an American, you need to know that basically our government does have the power at this point to loosely interpret the Constitution, and they also do have superiority over state governments for the most part. And that's why that court case matters. And I would like you to learn those for your test because those are things that are going to come back to you when you study government in 10th grade. And that's all we did in class today. As always, everything that's highlighted will be on the test. In this case, it's actually just going to be a quiz, but those are the quiz items that have been highlighted throughout. You can let me know if you have any questions.